For most One Piece fans, Nothing Happened is the most memorable moment from the Thriller Bark arc, and Zoro's best moment throughout the entire series. This moment embodies Zoro's image as Luffy's stoic and loyal right-hand man. And while I like the Nothing Happened moment, I personally think that it's a bit overrated. I don't think it's that great of a moment amongst the other iconic scenes in One Piece, or even similar self-sacrifice scenes in other anime and manga. So in this video I'll be explaining why the scene is so overrated, what the real appeal of the Nothing Happened moment is, and why it really doesn't work as Zoro's pivotal character moment, and which scene actually does serve that purpose in the story. The Nothing Happened moment comes at the very end of the Thriller Bark arc, after Gecko Moria and his zombies have been defeated. A second warlord, Bartholomew Kuma, arrives to eliminate the Straw Hats, and straight off the bat, Kuma picks out Zoro from the crowd and challenges him to a fight. At this point in the story, Kuma is way too strong for Zoro to beat alone, so Zoro offers him his head instead of Luffy's. And inspired by this, Kuma cuts Zoro a deal. If he can take on all of Luffy's pain, he will leave and spare all of their lives. Zoro accepts this and survives, silently taking on Luffy's burden without him ever knowing about it. This is one of the more memorable scenes in Thriller Bark and for Zoro's character as a whole, so why do I think this moment is overrated? Well, for one, I think the majority of the appeal of this scene comes from a place of power fantasy rather than a genuine or deep character moment. Moments before Zoro's sacrifice, every other Straw Hat and even the Rumbar pirates were fully willing to sacrifice their lives for Luffy's sake as well. The only difference is that they weren't strong enough to stay conscious after Kuma's Ursa's shock. Sanji was the one exception who was also able to stay conscious, and he even offered to take on Luffy's pain instead of Zoro, but Zoro knocked him out because he probably thought that he was the only one who could have actually survived, which is probably true because he only just barely survived himself. So if every other Straw Hat was already fully willing to sacrifice their own lives, then Zoro's sacrifice just shows that he's physically stronger and more durable than all of them, and nothing deeper beyond that. You can argue that Zoro took on more pain than anyone else, but taking on pain doesn't necessarily equate to good character writing. It's like when people argue about which anime characters suffer the most, as if that decides whether a character is good or not. But you can argue that it's not about the pain that Zoro took, it's the fact that he's willing to take on Luffy's pain and never complained or even mentioned it. This just shows that Zoro is the most stoic and masculine of all the Straw Hats, but that doesn't necessarily make him a better character. In fact, it's kind of the opposite. In the occasions where Nami and Usopp take on pain for Luffy's sake, it actually kind of hits harder because it's not in character for them to do so. This is not to say masculinity and stoicism aren't virtues, because that's probably where a lot of the appeal of this scene comes from. But a feat of mental strength is kind of like a feat of physical strength, as it doesn't necessarily correlate to great writing. So Zoro isn't special because he's willing to sacrifice his life, as every other Straw Hat would do so as well. Zoro just had the physical and mental strength to take on more pain, but pain, like I said, doesn't correlate to good writing. Now another argument is, the fact that Zoro is willing to sacrifice himself hits much more harder than any other Straw Hat because he is sacrificing his own dream, which is a much bigger deal. Every other Straw Hat has their own dream, and it's debatable which is actually the hardest to achieve, but when it comes to importance in the story, it's clear that Zoro's dream only comes second to Luffy's. Zoro's dream is the only one to be directly compared to Luffy's dream. Wanting to become the world's strongest swordsman is portrayed to be the perfect amount of ambition that you need to be the right-hand man of someone who wants to be the Pirate King. But something to note about Zoro's character is that even from the start, Zoro held up his dream even higher than his own life. Zoro believes that if he cannot defeat every opponent he comes up against, he isn't worthy of being the world's strongest swordsman, and as a result, he isn't worthy enough to live. So that means that the fact that Zoro's willing to put Luffy's dream even above his own is a huge deal, right? Well, this is clearly a shift in Zoro's belief, but I think the severity of it is just a result of Zoro having an extreme personality. To me, the fact that Zoro already values his own dreams over his life makes Zoro's self-sacrifice less impactful and not more impactful. The fact that Zoro keeps adding things higher up in importance than his life makes me feel like Zoro has a low regard for his life, rather than a high regard for his dream. Even in the Wano arc, Usopp criticizes the samurai for this exact same attitude, throwing away their lives too easily for the sake of pride and honor. In my opinion, it's much more impactful when characters like Nami and Usopp put Luffy's dream over their own lives, because they are inherently cowardly and have a normal human self-preservation instinct. So because they're supposed to be the most normal and relatable Straw Hats, it's a huge leap when they become extremely honorable and loyal to Luffy, at the cost of their own lives. The problem here is that what a character values is still relative to everything else that they value, so it really just depends what you relate to more. So this point is a bit subjective in that aspect. But to me, Usopp going from a normal human to honorable is much easier to relate to than Zoro going from already honorable to super honorable. But this also leads into the biggest argument for why nothing happened is a special moment for Zoro, and that is because it completes his character arc. Every Straw Hat besides Zoro has a clear arc where they join the crew and become loyal to Luffy. Usually it's in their introduction arc where we get a flashback explaining their past and why joining the Straw Hats will complete their story. For characters like Robin and Nami, they start as this loyal in their introductory arcs, but once we get to their rescue arc and we get their full flashback, they become fully loyal members like the rest of the crew. Now Sanji got an extra flashback and rescue arc on top of that, and Jinbei was always loyal to Luffy even before his dedicated arcs, but the pattern remains the same. You can typically point out the arc where every Straw Hat becomes loyal to Luffy. Every Straw Hat except for Zoro. We got Zoro's introduction in flashback in the very first arc of the series, but when he joins Luffy, he makes it very clear that his dream of being the world's strongest swordsman comes first. So Zoro putting Luffy's dream ahead of his own in Thriller Bark completes his character arc and cements him as a loyal Straw Hat. But the problem for me is how long it takes for this character moment to be paid off. By the time Zoro sacrificed himself in Thriller Bark, the Straw Hats have already faced death together in Alabasta, Skypiea, and Enies Lobby. Zoro even steps up and acts as a vice captain at times, leading the crew into battle when Luffy isn't around, but also guiding him on the proper way to be a captain. So there was no doubt in my mind that Zoro was a loyal Straw Hat by the time we got to the Thriller Bark arc. And I think the uncertainty of allegiance is what makes this type of character sacrifice so interesting in the first place. Take Piccolo's arc at the start of Dragon Ball Z for example. Piccolo was the villain of the previous arc until Raditz came around, so he formed a temporary alliance with Goku to defeat him. But with the arrival of two more Saiyans, Piccolo extended his alliance with the Z Fighters and even trained Gohan to prepare him for the fight. Piccolo still had his villainous ambitions, and his alliance was supposed to be temporary, which is why it was so surprising when he sacrificed himself to save Gohan. Piccolo's sacrifice was so impactful because we weren't sure if he was a good person until that very moment. In fact, Piccolo's sacrifice wasn't because he was redeemed. He was redeemed because of his sacrifice. The sacrifice is what redeemed him. Piccolo probably didn't even know he would sacrifice himself until it happened. That's what made the moment special. That's also why, despite all the attempts in the movies to replicate the magic of this moment, it always falls short. Because we already know Piccolo cares about Gohan by this point, so they're really just going through the motions. This is also how I feel about Zoro's sacrifice for Luffy. His actions feel like a result of his character, and not a change in his character. Now Zoro's arc isn't about a bad guy becoming good like Piccolo's, but the same logic still applies. For example, Naruto and Sasuke were rivals at the beginning of the series and at each other's necks. But it wasn't until the fight against Haku at the end of the arc when Sasuke sacrificed himself for Naruto, showing that they're actually brothers and not enemies. The point is that a character's sacrifice only works best when it happens before you'd expect the character to do so. That way it completes the character arc. When it comes to Zoro, his sacrifice came after so many arcs of him being loyal that it felt like he was just doing what he was supposed to do instead of a satisfying conclusion to a character arc. Now there are really two ways Oda could have made the conclusion to Zoro's arc more satisfying. And by conclusion to his arc, I'm not talking about him defeating Mihawk, I'm talking about his initial arc where he goes from prioritizing his own dream to prioritizing Luffy's dream and becoming a loyal Straw Hat. The first way Oda could have made Zoro's arc more satisfying is if Zoro's loyalties were in question for the entirety of the story up until the Thriller Bark arc. Imagine if Zoro's arc was like Robin's, who's joined the crew very quickly but kept her distance from them as she believed it was only a temporary thing. This would be even harder to pull off for Zoro, I believe, because by his nature, Zoro is a very straightforward and honest person, and a man of his word. I can't imagine Zoro being aloof like Robin and flanking on the crew. His personality is to take even more responsibility than necessary. So I don't think Oda could have downplayed Zoro's allegiance to the crew and have him still be the same character that we know. But what if Zoro's dream of becoming the world's strongest swordsman forced him to diverge with the crew? If an opportunity to become stronger came about, would Zoro leave the crew to pursue it? It would seem hypocritical after how Zoro reacted when Usopp left, but Zoro's problem wasn't with the fact that Usopp left. Zoro just wanted Usopp to rejoin in a respectful and honorable way, and he even threatened to leave the crew himself if the crew accepted Usopp back without him apologizing. So I don't think Zoro is opposed to crewmates leaving. Zoro didn't even seem to care too much when Nami, Robin, or Sanji left either. So I can possibly imagine Zoro going his own separate way early on in the East Blue Saga, but after he has his duel with Mihawk, I can't imagine Zoro leaving the crew early, for a reason I'll explain more in the second point. So the second option Oda had to make Zoro's arc more satisfying is to make his declaration of loyalty to Luffy happen a bit earlier in the story. There was only a few arcs between Nami and Robin's introductions and when they became loyal to the crew, and for every other Straw Hat, they became loyal to the crew the arc that they were introduced. But when it comes to Zoro, there are 3 entire sagas between his introduction and his supposed character moment in Thriller Bark. The reason why I say supposed is because I actually think Zoro's loyalty was already firmly established in the Baratier arc. After Zoro challenged and lost to Mihawk, Zoro cried and declared that he would never lose again. But what a lot of people miss is that this wasn't just a declaration, it was a promise aimed directly at Luffy, almost as if it was an offer. To me, this suggests that Zoro thought losing again would be letting down Luffy, which to me implies that he had already subordinated his dream of becoming the world's strongest swordsman under Luffy's dream of becoming the Pirate King. So to me, this is the moment where Zoro locks in with the crew. This is akin to Robin's I wanna live moment in Enies Lobby and Nami's help me moment in Arlong Park. I don't think it's as emotional or built up to as well as those 2 moments, but it serves the same purpose in the story in my opinion, which is an intimate moment between the captain and the subordinate, which convinces them to dedicate their lives to Luffy. So every moment after this is just a result of Zoro's already existing loyalty, including the nothing happened moment. So do I think nothing happened is a bad moment? No, obviously not. I agree that it's a cool moment and it shows off some of the best aspects of Zoro's character, like his stoicism and his loyalty. But I don't think this moment makes Zoro a great character in of itself, or satisfies any character arc that he had lingering on. This is just a pretty good Zoro moment that works for a less important and more self-contained arc like Thriller Bark. But the fact that this is perceived as the crown jewel of Zoro's entire character shows that something has seriously gone wrong with his character. I mean, a lot of what Thriller Bark is planting the seeds for a more important Wano arc that came later in the series. Like, you'd expect Zoro's best arc to be the Wano arc, given how much lore and screen time he got there. But the fact that 500 chapters later, Thriller Bark is still the peak of Zoro's character is honestly embarrassing. This is a problem with most of the Straw Hats post time skip, and I think people have noticed it when it came to characters like Chopper and Usopp, but I wanted to highlight it for characters like Zoro and eventually Robin. This video was originally part of a larger script I was working on about Zoro's wasted potential that I ended up splitting into several different videos because it got too long. But if you agree or disagree with my takes in this video, be sure to let me know in the comments below, as this channel is still small enough for me to read all of them. Also, be sure to subscribe if you're interested in more criticism and analysis for Zoro's character and the rest of the One Piece story as a whole. So with that, I'll see you in the next video.
You want head? Then I'll give you head.